All right, as you're finding your seats, I have placed today's objective on the screen if you want to take a moment and write that objective down. Only one objective today. As you can see by the title of the large group on your blue handout, and make out the key idea that's on the objective here, we are moving towards the American Revolution. We've been studying the colonies this last week. Previous to that, we were looking at the indigenous tribal peoples of the Americas. Now we're going to be approaching the events that lead to the American Revolution. And my job in the next 30-some minutes is to talk to you about multiple factors, multiple causes that help to explain why the British colonies will push for independence. And so those are the basic ideas. And as you can see by the way the handout is organized, there's four big factors I'm going to talk you through today. They're all separated by Roman numerals, and so that goes through the organization of the large group lecture. For many of you in small group last week, you were able to get through an explanation and a couple of activities that took you through the various regions that are going to form within the British colonies. And then many of you towards the end of the week started talking about maybe and looking at this event that happened in history called the French and Indian War, this war between the French and the British that happens in 1754. It's going to occur for about 9 years, so 1763. This war between the French and the British to decide who was going to control North America and those particular colonies. Were they going to be French? Were they going to be British? What empire, what European empire is going to control North America? And after that war, there is going to be emerging within the British colonies, because of course the British win. The British defeat the French. The British and the American colonists, who are British, and their allies of the native tribes defeat the French. And with that victory will come some growing political conflict amongst the American colonists and mother country England. So that's the first particular factor I want to talk to you about, because there are a good number of historians who say this factor is the most important in regards to this growing conflict that is political in nature between the American colonists and Britain. And I start off by having you remember a little bit from world history, and that is the Enlightenment period. There were these Enlightenment philosophers who began to write books and to discuss politics. And they were beginning to challenge this concept of the divine right of kings, this idea that kings were given the okay to rule by God, and God gave them this right to rule over the people within their kingdom, and no one could question that because it was a God-given right given to the king. And so then, of course, the king governed over his people, and sometimes the king allowed rights of the citizens. Well, these growing Enlightenment philosophers, people like John Locke and Montesquieu, started to write books challenging that idea. And this new phenomenon that's on the screen there, natural rights, becomes a new idea that these philosophers put forth. They're going to argue, no, kings are not given the right to rule by God. That is not accurate. Governments come to exist because there are these natural rights that people are born with. Yes, natural rights are rights that people are born with. Some of the famous ones that you've heard because of our famous documents: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, or property. These are all rights that, according to these philosophers, these are things that people are just born with. Because they're human beings, they're born with them. They're not coming from a king. They're not coming because governments grant them those things. And in fact, the philosophers of the Enlightenment said that it's the people that then create governments, not God and not kings. And so therefore, basically this is a huge challenge to the idea of divine right of kings and monarchies, of course, of which Britain was a monarchy, much like there were many monarchies in England. But this idea of natural rights becomes a new challenging idea to the British monarchy system. This idea that, hey, if people have the right of life and liberty and property, then therefore we're going to challenge this authority that is continuing to argue that people don't have a final say in their government. Okay? So however you want to put that in your notes, you need to stress the idea of this natural rights being a new phenomenon that European philosophers are writing about, and the American colonists are reading these books, and they're quickly agreeing to some of these new ideas of challenging this idea of a monarchy and this divine right of kings idea. Okay? You have a picture here. James Otis, one of the early colonists who begin to challenge some of the rules and some of the laws and authority of the British, starts to use these ideas of natural rights. Maybe one of the more famous founding fathers that you're aware would be like Thomas Jefferson, who of course is the author of eventually the Declaration of Independence, and he uses a lot of those ideas of natural rights. I mentioned them: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Those phrases are found right in our Declaration of Independence. And arguing also that the people have a right to overthrow a government that doesn't protect those rights. All those ideas are found in the Declaration, and they come from the Enlightenment. They come from this natural rights philosophy that was very different than the monarchy system of divine right of kings. Okay? Now, so just in case you didn't know how to spell enlightenment, I put them up there, but I think the word enlightenment philosophers is even in your notes somewhere. You can just circle that. Those are the people I was talking about, those writers like Locke and Montesquieu and Rousseau, all those European philosophers.
President recognizes Mr. Adams of Massachusetts.
Objects of the most stupendous magnitude. Measures which will affect the lives of millions, born and unborn, are now before us. We must expect a great expense of blood to obtain them. But we must always remember that a free constitution of civil government cannot be purchased at too dear a rate, as there is nothing on this side of Jerusalem of greater importance to mankind. My worthy colleague from Pennsylvania has spoken with great ingenuity and eloquence. He has given you a grim prognostication of our national future, but where he foresees apocalypse, I see hope. I see a new nation ready to take its place in the world. Not an empire, but a republic. And a republic of laws, not men. Gentlemen, we are in the very midst of revolution. The most complete, unexpected, and remarkable of any in the history of the world. How few of the human race have ever had an opportunity of choosing a system of government for themselves and their children. I am not without apprehensions, gentlemen. But the end we have in sight is more than worth all the means. I believe, sirs, that the hour has come. My judgment approves this measure, and my whole heart is in it. All that I have, all that I am, and all that I hope in this life, I am now ready to stake upon it. While I live, let me have a country. A free country.
All right, that was a little clip from an HBO documentary series, almost like one of those mini-series, in which, in this case, one of our founding fathers, John Adams, is speaking to the rest of the Second Continental Congress, promoting these ideas that the colonists are hoping to embark on, this new political idea that people can form their own government, form a republic of which the people have final say, not a king. And he was trying to assert to those particular men gathered there that they are doing the right thing by moving towards revolution and overthrowing an old monarchical system and coming up with a new form of government, a republic in which natural rights are going to be the foundational principle. Okay? So, with that being said, there's another political aim here, and that is there's an idea that I know you've heard of since you were in grade school. This idea of representation. The idea that does a government have the right to pass laws in which the people have no say? And in this case, after the French and Indian War, Great Britain is going to start passing some laws, taxation laws, that to some colonists, they're going to say, hey, these laws are unjust. These laws violate my natural rights and our rights as citizens of Great Britain because we didn't get to actually vote for the representative that is voting in Parliament to pass such laws. And the famous quote here, no taxation without representation, is put into place. So there's an argument. Does one, a citizen, have a natural right of being able to vote no or yes on a representative who then passes laws for others? Or does that not pertain to a right of a citizen? Well, of course, it was the American colonists living in these 13 colonies who are going to start to argue this is a political right that we firmly believe in. And that is one of the rationales for their political motives of revolution. Okay? And we're going to come back to taxes here in a little bit, but from a different angle. The last one, Parliament. Now this represents a picture of modern-day Parliament. Big Ben there, the clock, okay? There had been a form of representation already going on in England. Yes, it was a monarchy, but there was a semblance of representation, okay? But here's the big clincher here in your notes. During this whole decades conflict, Parliament had passed a law called the Declaratory Act. And the word declare is very important here, the root word. The Declaratory Act, which basically was a law that said Parliament over in England can pass whatever laws it wants to over the colonies over in the New World. If we want to pass a tax, we have the power to pass a tax. If we want to have a law that regulates certain trades and actions of those colonists across the ocean, we have the supreme power over them. Parliament and the monarch is supreme over the colonial peoples in a Virginia or a Massachusetts colony. And that's going to become fundamental in some of the compelling arguments back and forth. Who has power? Is it the people living in a certain area like Massachusetts or Virginia? Do they have supreme power? Or does power rest in a national government under a parliament or a monarchy? All right, so that Declaratory Act is one of these things that's going to, of course, really upset a growing number of colonists living in these British 13 colonies here. So, in a quick summation, some historians argue it was about all these political ideals, the ideals of natural rights, of being able to govern oneself, self-government, being able to elect a representative who then makes choices on our behalf. That is what this revolution is all about, political ideals, okay? That's one argument. But there are some historians who say, well, that's true, but maybe there are some other motivations that explain why these 13 colonies will rise up. And maybe it's not as political as it is economic. So the second one here on the very front page of your notes would be economic in nature. Were there some economic factors that is going to eventually push the colonists away from the British Empire and the British government? And I mentioned the French-Indian War at the beginning of my large group because it is a pivotal event that really changes some things. And one thing that comes out of that war that you need to know about is that the British, because they fought the French and it took them so many years to reach victory, it cost the British a lot of money to bring soldiers over and fight and to fund all the weaponry and to continue to defend all these colonists who are living over here on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. It costs money, and they're going to go into debt. And so after the war is over, the British are going to say, we got to pay for this debt. We have to pay for these soldiers who went over and fought the French to protect these 13 colonies, so let's pass some new taxes. So new taxes are going to be passed after the French-Indian War. And I want you just to be able to be aware of what some of these new taxes are, okay? A lot of these taxes are going to be placed on goods coming to the colonies from somewhere else. Let me say that again. The first type of taxes that are going to be placed are going to be taxes on goods that are coming into the colonies, on ships. We call them imports. Imports. Goods that are created somewhere else being imported to the colonies. You might also want to put your notes that this is a external type of tax because the good is coming from somewhere else. External. Okay, an external tax. You could also put down in your notes that these types of taxes, of which are taxing an imported good, are also indirect. Because when these goods are being sent, let's just say from the West Indies, the British West Indies, or maybe Mother London, okay, and they land at the port city, like a Charleston or a Boston, there's a tax placed on them. Well, who pays the tax? Well, the person who's the merchant who buys the good right off of the ship. And it's then, if they have to pay the tax, what does it do to the cost of their good? It raises it a little bit because they had to pay for the good plus a little tax. And then what does that particular merchant do if they're a smart merchant? They're going to raise the price of that good to pay for that tax. We call that then an indirect tax because who paid for it? The person right there, the merchant, right when it got off the ship. Okay? So it's an external type of tax because it's coming from somewhere else. It's indirect because the merchant paid for it and then passed on the price by raising the price. Okay? And it's a way for England to start making money after the French and Indian War. Well, some colonists are not going to like this. They're going to say, hey, this is hurting us because now you have to pay a tax on these external goods, and we don't quite like the negative impact it's having on some of us who are American merchants. So the economic cost here is, I don't like the fact that all of a sudden it's making these goods more expensive. I might not be selling as many of them, or I'd like to buy my goods from somewhere else, but now the British is telling me no, I've got to buy them from England. And these are all external/indirect types of taxes. Well, of course, the colonists are not going to like them, so they're going to put boycotts in place. Some of the colonists are going to say, fine, we'll just not buy European goods. We won't buy your British goods. We won't buy your sugar, for example. Put this down. Sugar is one of the earliest examples of a type of tax like this. It was called the Sugar Act. And so the colonists say, fine, we won't buy British sugar. We'll see how that goes for you guys and these companies who are British companies. You're not going to do so well economically because we're just not going to buy British sugar. And we'll boycott you until you change this law. And so these boycotts get put into place, and they're pretty effective because within a short period of time, all these British sugar merchants go to Parliament and say, we're really hurt here. Nobody's buying our sugar over in the colonies. Get rid of that law. And so Parliament will. Hey, a colonial victory. Boycotts work. Well then, they're still in debt, so Parliament says, okay, well, we still need money. Let's do another type of tax. And the most famous one of these is a direct tax. Now, a direct means whoever is purchasing the item pays for it right when they purchase it. The consumer. When the consumer directly pays for the item, there's a tax on that item additionally. And the most famous one of these is the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is going to be the example of a direct tax. Oops, I went too fast. But a direct tax is one in which is placed right there on the good at the time of its purchase. And the Stamp Act is an example of one. And also put this in your notes. This is an example of an internal tax. Internal, not external. Which means the good was produced where? If it's internal, the good is produced in the colonies. Okay? So any official paper goods, deck of cards, documents, had to have an official stamp placed on them. And these goods weren't created somewhere else. They were created in the colonies. And what you need to put down in your notes is, this is going to inflame even more colonists who are saying, this is not right. Number one, no taxation without representation, which is a political argument. But economically, who's being hurt by this? All the colonists who are buying paper items and, of course, official documents. All these are having a tax. It's like, it's hurting us. We're having to pay for all this, and we don't think it's right. And so they really go after the stamp tax collectors. The stamp tax is a very, very upsetting law that more and more of the colonists are upset with, that one could argue is economically causing these colonists to eventually side with and eventually push for revolution. The last one on your notes that deals with this, that's economic in nature, is I mentioned the French and Indian War, and after the French and Indian War, the British say, we just spent a whole bunch of money protecting the British colonists, and some of the people we were fighting were these native tribes, so let's build, actually build is the wrong word, let's establish a boundary. And as you can see, that red line there, that's the boundary. We're going to have a boundary line. It's basically the Appalachian Mountains. And we're going to tell the British colonists, hey, you can't move west of that boundary. You have to just stay within the eastern part of those lands. Don't cross the Appalachian Mountains, because we don't want you to get further and further inland, because you're going to have to fight off Indian tribes, and we don't want to come and have to bail you out again by sending our military to fight the different tribes there. So we're going to establish a boundary. It's called the Proclamation Line. Proclamation Line is what it's called. The word is right there. If you want to know the year, it's 1763. Proclamation Line, 1763. And it basically told the British colonists, Massachusetts, Virginia, the Carolinas, you can't move west of that line. Now let me tell you why this is economically upsetting to some of the colonists. They would love to buy land west of that line and settle there. And some of them had already bought land west of that line, thinking that someday that land is going to be worth a lot of money. Well, now if the British are saying you can't settle west of that line, what happens to the value of that land? So those speculators who had speculated on that land being valuable someday have just potentially lost all kinds of money and investment by purchasing land west of that line. So economically, some of those particular colonists are very upset and say, we don't like this line because it hurts us economically and our potential of going westward and selling land and buying land and so on. So these are all economic factors now that some historians are arguing are going to cause more and more of these colonists to eventually push for revolution and independence. Okay? So hopefully right now, halfway through, you have in your notes some ideas of how this is a political type of revolution and how arguments could be made that this is all about politics and government and political ideals. And you've got some ideas now that are economic in nature, hurting the colonists economically, that would then cause them to push for independence. And then there's this, regulation of trade. Still the last thing on that first side there. Here's the British saying, you can't buy from the French. You can't buy from the British. You have to buy British goods, and we're going to enforce it. If you're trying to smuggle goods from another merchant from another country, no, 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 no. And here's the type of goods you can buy from the British. The very famous one is tea. You've all heard this since grade school, middle school. Okay? You've got to buy your tea now from this British company over here. You can't have a choice to buy it from somewhere else. So the regulation of trade is one more little chink that in the armor of loyalty that now the more and more colonists are saying, I don't know if I like this, all these regulations that Parliament and the King is placing on me. I want to choose, and I want to directly have a say in what kinds of trade I can take part in, or what kind of goods I can buy, and from whom. So economics is that second factor. But now if you turn on the back side, you're going to get into factors 3 and 4 here in the last part of my large group. Okay? Here's the famous Anti-Stamp Act piece of literature that people in the colonies were known to see. They would put it in like a skull and crossbones. That's how much dislike they had for the Stamp Act. Okay? Then there are some historians who say, well, that might have been economic. It might have been political. Not 8 minutes. All right. 10 minutes? Not even? You telling me I've got to start going faster? Yeah. All right. There are some historians who say, look, one of the reasons why the American Revolution happened was because the population was changing in the colonies. The population was much different than it was in Mother England. And this pie graph hopefully shows you that. And you could only put this. The population is becoming more diverse. That when you count the number of black slaves, Dutch, Swedes, all those little pieces of the pie over there on the right side by 1755, they're just not all British anymore. And so one could make the argument that there is some population changes and it's growing faster, and so therefore these people aren't really equated with being loyalty to the British anymore. And then add that to one more thing, the idea of diversity within the colonial population. You can see that in the pie graph there. Add one more notion to this, and that is an argument about, well, maybe we don't want to stick around with the British Empire anymore because we don't like some of the things socially in which society is created upon. This idea of an aristocracy, where because of your last name, you are of a certain class in British society. That because your uncle is a lord and has a last name of Robertson, all the Robertsons will always have this class in society because you come from the Robertson lineage. Versus if you were a commoner, well, you don't have the last name, you don't have the heredity, so you'll never rise in British society because you don't have that hereditary status. That's what we call an aristocracy, where people, because of heredity, normally rule and have a higher class setting. Okay? And the British had such a system. And a growing number of American colonists were not part of the aristocracy. They were part of this commoner class. Some of them had maybe gotten really wealthy, the Washingtons, the Jeffersons, and so on, but they never rose to that aristocracy class. So some historians argue that the American Revolution happened because they said this is the wrong way to organize a society. That it should be done through a meritocracy. Merit is the root word here. Through achievement, through talent. That is how you rise in society. If you are intelligent, you rise in society by your actions and by your talent and by your achievements. That is how one should rise in society. Not by the last name you have, but by the things you do and accomplish, and by the natural talent that one brings. That's what should raise you into society. And one thing that we do know is here in America today, even in the modern era, we don't have any sirs and duchesses and dukes. All those labels went away. Whereas if you still go and live in England, you still hear about people getting knighted. And, Sir Paul McCartney, great Beatles, who you heard the song being played, is now given somewhat of a status in British society. Well, we don't believe that in America. We believe in meritocracy. So some would argue it's part of the social factors that caused the American Revolution, getting rid of the old aristocracy, heredity basis of social class, and more of a merit-based type of system, okay? Now, last but not least is propaganda. Some historians say, okay, well, there might have been some social factors, political factors, or economic factors, but you're forgetting one thing. Most colonists could have cared less about those things. And here you have a little pie graph telling you how American society was roughly split. That you had the patriots, they were the pro-revolution, they made up about 40% of the population. You had the people who are loyalists, people who wanted to remain loyal to the British Empire and didn't want revolution, they made up about 20%. And then the neutral people, the people who really didn't take a position, they made up 40%. Now the motion here that I'm trying to communicate to you is, by no means did the majority of the colonists want to go overthrow the British. We're talking about only 40%, not even a majority of the population. So how all of a sudden was that 40% able to get enough support to successfully overthrow and push for the 13 colonies towards independence? I would argue, and some historians argue, it's propaganda. How do you make somebody think something and think in a certain way and adopt your position on things? Some say it was people like Sam Adams, who was a master propagandist. Sam Adams is one of our founding fathers. And Sam Adams and others like him were very good about speeches, about artwork, about literature, to try to get people to, oh crap. Oh, great. Okay, I'll just talk loud, but my microphone went off. So, these are people who created little groups like the Sons of Liberty, be a bunch of radicals, who said, look, it's our goal to try to convince all the neutrals out there and the rest of us to join our cause. And if that means we have to persuade people by what we say and how we say it, by putting forth types of artwork out there that are going to convey a certain meaning, so be it. And eventually propaganda will get more people to support our cause, and of course our cause would be independence. All right? Now, Sam Adams, master propagandist, one of the most famous forms of artwork that's going to depict this would be how the Patriots and the Radical Sons of Liberty will portray a famous event, the Boston Massacre.
Everything most Americans know about the Boston Massacre comes from this engraving. The patriot Paul Revere created it 5 years before his legendary midnight ride. The widely circulated picture shows a small group of unarmed civilians being cut down by a volley of musket fire. The picture has been reprinted in countless history books and pamphlets and has been the defining image of the incident for more than 2 centuries.
But it's not accurate. That depiction that you've probably all seen since you were little kids is not accurate, okay? There were about 50 or 60 colonists throwing snowballs at the British soldiers. Some of those snowballs had rocks put in them, okay? So they were stirring up trouble. Soldiers open fire and 5 colonists are killed. That's the facts, okay? But the actual piece of propaganda to get more and more colonists to feel anti-British and to feel that it was a massacre was going to be portrayed in the artistic expression. So Butcher's Hall, that was not the name of the building, okay? 50, 60 colonists, that's not what that picture portrays. But what have you portrayed here is just a total massacre. All those guns firing upon, a group of people that were doing nothing wrong. Okay? So, propaganda, this is just one piece. The Boston Massacre is just one piece of propaganda that one could argue leads to the American Revolution. Now, I'm going to let you pack up, but don't forget to upload your notes onto your teacher's Google Classroom. And then in small group, we'll be tackling the events of the Revolution further. When the bell rings, you are dismissed.